There are names that are known in every language in the world. Alexander the Great, a man who lived for only 32 years, yet in that lifetime, as brief as a flash of lightning, he managed to forever change the map of the world. He ascended to the throne at 20, and by his 30th year, the entire known world lay at his feet. From the Greek city-states to the scorching sands of Egypt, from the snow-capped mountains of Persia to the jungles of India. But who was he in reality? A brilliant strategist who never lost a single battle? A philosopher on the throne, the student of the great Aristotle who dreamed of uniting all peoples? Or was he a ruthless tyrant, drunk on his own power? A man who sincerely believed that the blood of Zeus himself flowed through his veins. In this story, we will walk with him step by step along his entire incredible path. We will see how the young prince tames an untamable horse feared by the greatest riders. We will witness how he cuts the Gordian Knot, defying destiny itself. We will cross scorching deserts and icy mountains with him. We will see the flames of Persepolis and hear the roar of war elephants in the mists of India. We will attempt to unravel the mystery of his sudden and enigmatic death in Babylon at the very peak of his power. And we will ask the question, where did his tomb, for centuries a place of pilgrimage for emperors, disappear, only to dissolve into the sands of time? But this is not simply a story of conquests, swords, and battles. This is a story about the limits of human potential, about the dream of reaching the very edge of the world, and about the price a man pays for the immortality of his name.
Our story begins in the north of the Balkan Peninsula, in lands that the refined Greeks of Athens and Sparta long considered wild and barbaric. This is Macedonia, a realm of high mountains, dense forests, and a stern people accustomed to settling disputes with the sword, not in philosophical debates. It was here, in the ancient capital of Pella, during the hot summer of 356 BC, that a boy was born. The date of his birth, as befits a legend, is shrouded in myth. It was said that on the very night he came into the world, far away in Asia Minor, one of the greatest temples of antiquity, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, burned to the ground. The priests whispered that the goddess was too busy assisting in the birth of the future Lord of Asia to save her own home. His father was King Philip II, a man of iron will, a cunning politician, and a brilliant reformer of the army. Philip inherited a weak, strife-torn Macedonia and transformed it into the most powerful military machine of his era. He was a warrior to the bone, one-eyed, lame, covered in scars. He spent his life in the saddle and on military campaigns. But Alexander's mother was a woman of a completely different nature. Olympias, a princess from mountainous Epirus, was a passionate, mystical woman, initiated into the secret cults of Dionysus. Rumors swirled that live snakes slept in her bed, and it was she who, from his earliest days, instilled in little Alexander the idea that would define his entire life. She whispered to him that his true father was not Philip, but the supreme god Zeus himself, who had come to her in the form of a lightning bolt. Alexander grew up with an absolute, unshakable faith in his divine nature and great destiny. Alexander's childhood was not ordinary. He knew no idleness. Philip, wishing to raise the ideal heir, a warrior who would surpass himself, entrusted his upbringing to his relative, Leonidas. Leonidas was a harsh tutor, a proponent of Spartan discipline.
The young prince was not spoiled with luxury. He was taught to endure hunger and thirst, to sleep on a hard bed, and to wear light clothing even in the cold. Leonidas often personally checked the boy's chests to ensure his doting mother had not slipped him warm clothes or sweets. This upbringing tempered his body and his will, teaching him to despise physical hardship. But Alexander was not just resilient. he was incredibly observant and intelligent. The story that best describes his character occurred when he was about 12 years old. One day, a horse trader from Thessaly arrived at King Philip's court. He brought with him a magnificent, enormous black stallion with a white mark on its forehead resembling an ox's head. The price demanded for the horse was unthinkable: 13 talents. But there was one problem. The animal was utterly wild. None of the king's best horsemen could even approach it, let alone mount it. The stallion reared, kicked, and bit. An enraged Philip ordered the useless animal to be taken away. And then, young Alexander intervened. He exclaimed, "What a horse they are losing, these people, just because out of fear and ignorance they cannot master him." His father chuckled at his son's audacity and proposed a wager. If Alexander could tame the beast, Philip would buy him the horse. If not, the boy would pay for it himself. Alexander approached the horse. He had noticed what the experienced warriors had not. The horse was not afraid of the men, but of its own shadow dancing before it on the ground. The youth gently took the horse by the bridle and turned its head toward the sun. The shadow vanished. The stallion calmed down. Alexander, whispering soothing words to it, leaped onto its back and galloped away. When he returned, the courtiers erupted in ovation. Philip, with tears of pride in his eyes, kissed his son and uttered prophetic words. "My son, look for a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." This horse was named Bucephalus. He would become Alexander's faithful companion for the next 20 years and would travel with him all the way to India. But Philip understood, to rule the world, strength alone is not enough. Reason is needed. And when Alexander turned 13, the king hired for him the best tutor that could be found in all of Hellas. This tutor was Aristotle. A secluded spot in the town of Myesa, in the sacred grove of the nymphs, was set aside for their studies. It was a true boarding school for Alexander and the sons of the Macedonian nobility, his future generals and companions, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cassander. Here, in the shade of the trees, far from palace intrigues, the greatest philosopher of antiquity taught the greatest conqueror of the future. Aristotle opened the world of knowledge to Alexander. They studied not only rhetoric and politics, but also medicine, geography, zoology, and ethics. Alexander absorbed everything like a sponge. Aristotle instilled in him a passion for research, for knowing how the world was structured. Later, during his campaigns, Alexander would send his teacher samples of rare plants and animals from conquered lands. But Aristotle's greatest gift was the love of reading. He gave Alexander a scroll of Homer's Iliad. Alexander read this poem until it was in tatters. He knew it by heart. Achilles, the hero of the Trojan War, became his idol, his role model. Alexander would keep this scroll of the Iliad for his entire life, placing it under his pillow at night, next to his dagger. He fell asleep dreaming of a glory that would outshine the glory of the heroes of antiquity. At 16, his education ended. Alexander's childhood came to an abrupt halt. Philip set off on another military campaign to besiege the city of Byzantium and left his 16-year-old son as regent of Macedonia, entrusting him with the management of the state and the royal seal. This was the first real test of power, and Alexander did not disappoint. When a Thracian tribe, the Maedi, decided to take advantage of the king's absence and rose in rebellion, the young ruler did not wait for help. He gathered the remaining troops, marched swiftly against the enemy, crushed the rebels, drove them out of their city, and repopulated it with colonists, renaming it in his own honor, Alexandropolis. It was the first but far from the last city that would bear his name. When Philip returned, he was pleased, but at the same time a chasm began to grow between father and son. The son's successes aroused in Philip not only pride, but also jealousy, and Alexander, convinced of his divine origin and incited by his mother Olympias, increasingly chafed at the role of a mere heir. The palace in Pella was turning into a battlefield of two enormous egos. Two bears were becoming crowded in one den. Alexander had grown up. He was better educated than any Greek, hardened like a Spartan, and as ambitious as a god. He was ready for great deeds. But first he had to survive in his own house, where intrigues had become more dangerous than open war, and where a family dinner could end in murder. By 337 BC, the relationship between Alexander and his father, King Philip, resembled a taut bowstring, ready to snap at any moment. Philip was a great ruler, but he was aging. His body was scarred from battles, and his temper was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Alexander, convinced of his own greatness and egged on by his mother Olympias, craved power and glory. He feared only one thing, that his father would conquer the entire world without him, leaving him no glory to achieve. The spark that ignited the fire was Philip's new marriage. The king fell in love. His chosen one was a young Macedonian aristocrat named Cleopatra, not to be confused with the Egyptian queen. For Olympias, Alexander's mother, this was not just an insult. It was a political catastrophe. She was from Epirus, a foreigner. Philip's new wife was a pure-blooded Macedonian. If they had a son, Alexander's position as heir would be threatened. The scandal erupted right at the wedding feast. The wine flowed freely. The bride's uncle, the general, Attalus, heavily drunk, raised his cup and called upon the Macedonians to pray to the gods that a legitimate heir to the throne be born from this marriage. It was a direct attack. Alexander leaped to his feet, hurled his own cup at Attalus and screamed, "And what am I, in your opinion? A bastard?" An enraged Philip drew his sword and rushed at his own son. But his legs, weakened by wine and old wounds, failed him. The king stumbled and collapsed on the floor. Alexander, looking at his fallen father, uttered a chilling phrase that all present would remember. "Look, here is the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, but cannot cross from one couch to another without falling." After this quarrel, Alexander, along with his mother, fled Macedonia. The break seemed final, but Philip was too cunning a politician to lose such an heir. After a few months, through the mediation of friends, they reconciled.
Alexander returned to Pella, but trust was lost forever. The palace turned into a nest of vipers, where everyone awaited a stab in the back. The denouement came in the summer of 336 BC. In the ancient capital of Macedonia, the city of Aigi, a grand wedding was being prepared. Philip was marrying off his daughter, Alexander's sister, to the king of Epirus. It was meant to be a celebration of reconciliation and a demonstration of Macedonia's power before the great campaign against Persia, which Philip had planned his entire life. Guests from all over Greece gathered for the festivities. On the wedding day, Philip, dressed in a snow-white cloak and without bodyguards, wishing to show his trust in the people, entered the theatre. On either side of him walked two Alexanders, his son and his son-in-law. At that moment, a young man leaped from the crowd. It was Pausanias, one of the king's guards, harboring a deep personal grudge against Philip. He ran up to the king and plunged a Celtic dagger between his ribs. Philip fell dead. The assassin dashed toward his waiting horses, but became entangled in a grapevine, fell, and was immediately caught and killed by his pursuers. The king's death plunged Macedonia into chaos. Riots could erupt at any second. The tribes on the borders were ready to revolt. The Greek cities, conquered by Philip, were already dreaming of freedom.
Inside the palace, various factions of the nobility were ready to start a massacre for the throne. But Alexander acted with frightening speed, like lightning. That same day, without giving anyone time to recover, he was proclaimed king by the army. The soldiers loved him, and that decided everything. The 20-year-old youth placed his father's diadem on his head, and his first act was to clear his path to absolute power. The purge began. All possible contenders for the throne, all real and imagined conspirators, were executed. His mother, Olympias, returned from exile and acted even more cruelly.
While Alexander was away from the palace, she ordered the killing of Philip's young wife and her newborn daughter. It is said the infant was killed right in its mother's arms. When Alexander learned of this, he was furious, but the deed was done. He had no more rivals within the family. He was the only one. But the external threat was far more serious. Hearing of the death of the Iron Philip, and that some boy had taken the throne, Greece rose in revolt. Thebes and Athens, the two largest city-states, declared their independence and called on the others to expel the Macedonians. Alexander had to prove he was not just his father's son, but a force the whole world would have to reckon with. He gathered his army and moved south, with such incredible speed that the Greeks simply did not believe their eyes when they saw him under the walls of Thebes. Thebes was an ancient and proud city, the birthplace of heroes. It refused to surrender, relying on its powerful walls. Alexander decided to make an example of them. The assault began. The Macedonian phalanx and cavalry stormed the city. The slaughter began. Alexander ordered not just to capture, but to annihilate Thebes. One of the greatest cities of Hellas was wiped off the face of the earth. Temples, houses, walls, everything was destroyed. 30,000 inhabitants were sold into slavery. Only one house remained standing, the house of the poet Pindar, as a sign of Alexander's respect for art. This cruelty had the desired effect. All of Greece froze in terror. Athens, which had just been calling for war, immediately sent ambassadors with congratulations and expressions of submission. Alexander had achieved his goal. A deathly silence reigned in Europe. His rear was secure. Now that power was in his hands, the army fanatically loyal, and his enemies turned to ash, nothing held him back in the west. He could finally fulfill his father's dream, and his own. He turned his gaze to the east, beyond the Hellespont, to where the vast, rich, and seemingly invincible Persian Empire stretched. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander of Macedon, at the head of a 40,000-strong army, set out on a campaign from which he was not fated to return home. He was not just going to conquer lands. He was going to become a legend. In the spring of 334 BC, a vast army reached the shores of the Hellespont, the strait we today call the Dardanelles. It is a narrow strip of water separating Europe and Asia. On one bank stood Alexander's army, about 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. On the other stretched the enormous, ancient, and fabulously wealthy Persian Empire. Alexander's crossing was not a simple military maneuver. It was a carefully orchestrated spectacle, designed to show both gods and men that it was not merely a conqueror entering Asia, but a new hero, equal to Achilles. In the middle of the strait, Alexander sacrificed a bull to Poseidon, the god of the seas, pouring wine from a golden cup directly into the waves. And as his ship approached the Asian shore, he, clad in full armor, hurled his spear. It plunged forcefully into the sand. Alexander was the first to leap onto the land, pull out the spear, and declare for all to hear that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods, a spear-won land.
The Persians, of course, knew of the invasion. But the great king Darius III, ruling from distant Babylon, at first did not take the threat seriously. He considered it just another raid by barbarians and entrusted his satraps in Asia Minor to deal with it. The satraps gathered an impressive army and met Alexander on the bank of the Granicus River. The Battle of the Granicus became the first serious test for the Macedonian army on foreign soil. The Persians occupied the high, steep bank of the river, expecting that the Macedonians would not be able to cross under a hail of arrows. Alexander's old generals, like the experienced Parmenion, advised not to risk it and to wait until morning. But Alexander replied, "I would be ashamed before the Hellespont if we were to be stopped by some stream." He personally led the cavalry charge, plunging across the river directly into the ranks of the Persian horsemen. The battle turned into a chaotic and brutal melee.
Alexander was easily recognizable by his magnificent helmet with white plumes. He was the main target. At one point he was surrounded. A Persian commander, Mithridates, had already raised his axe over Alexander's head, ready to deliver the fatal blow. Alexander did not see him. History could have ended right there, in the waters of the Granicus. But in a fraction of a second, Cleitusъ the Black, commander of the royal guard and Alexander's childhood friend, saved him. With a single blow, he severed the Persian's arm, preserving his king's life. Both of them would forever remember this moment, but their friendship, saved in battle, would years later end in tragedy at a feast. The victory at the Granicus opened the gates of Asia Minor to Alexander. The Greek cities under Persian rule welcomed him as a liberator. Sardis, the capital of ancient Lydia, surrendered without a fight, handing over its treasury to Alexander. He advanced ever further south and east, freeing cities and untangling the complex knots of local politics. In the winter of 333, Alexander's army reached the ancient city of Gordium. In the center of the city, in the temple of Zeus, stood an old wagon. The pole of this wagon was tied to the yoke with an incredibly complex knot of cornel bark. The ends of the knot were not visible, and it was considered impossible to untie. There existed an ancient prophecy. He who could undo this knot would become the lord of all Asia. Alexander entered the temple. A crowd of Phrygians and his own soldiers gathered around him. Everyone awaited a miracle. Alexander studied the knot for a long time, trying to find the ends, but in vain. The knot was blind. The tension mounted. Failure could be interpreted as a bad omen. And then Alexander, realizing that cunning would not bring him victory, decided to act with force. He drew his sword and exclaimed, "It matters not how it is undone." With a single blow of his sword, he sliced the knot in half. That night, a terrible thunderstorm broke out, which the priests interpreted as a sign of Zeus's approval. Alexander had shown the world his method. He would not untangle the complex problems of the East. He would cut them with his sword. But the main battle was still ahead. Darius III finally understood that he was facing not an ordinary robber, but a mortal threat. He gathered a gigantic imperial army, whose numbers, according to various estimates, reached 100,000 men, and personally marched to meet the Macedonians. The meeting of the two rulers took place in the autumn of 333 at Issus, in a narrow coastal valley between the sea and the mountains. The terrain favored Alexander. In the narrow passage, the Persians' vast numerical superiority lost its significance. They simply could not deploy their ranks. The Battle of Issus became a masterpiece of Alexander's tactics. While his infantry, the famous Macedonian phalanx armed with long sarissa spears, held back the onslaught of the huge Persian mass, Alexander, at the head of his heavy cavalry, found a gap in the enemy's lines. He saw Darius's golden chariot in the center of the host and directed his strike directly there. It was an attack not on an army, but on one man. Alexander, hacking his way through the ranks of bodyguards, sought a personal encounter with the great king. Darius, seeing the approach of this rider with a mad look in his eyes, faltered. His nerves gave way. Turning his chariot around, the Lord of Asia fled, abandoning his army, his treasures, and, what was an unheard-of disgrace, his family. Seeing the king's flight, the Persian army crumbled. Alexander's victory was complete. In the captured Persian camp, the Macedonians discovered a luxury they had never seen: tents embroidered with gold, portable baths, precious tableware. But the main trophy was the family of Darius, his mother, his wife, and his 2 daughters.
They sat in their tent, awaiting death or dishonor, certain that Darius was dead. But Alexander showed a magnanimity that astonished the ancient world. He sent a messenger to them to report that Darius was alive, and then visited them personally. When Darius's mother, mistaking Alexander for his friend Hephaestion, who was taller, fell at the wrong man's feet, Alexander only smiled and said, "Do not worry, mother. He too is Alexander." He guaranteed their safety and preserved their titles and upkeep. This was a shrewd political move. Alexander showed that he was at war not with women, but for the throne, and already considered himself the legitimate successor to Darius, taking his new family under his protection. The victory at Issus opened his way to the south, to Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt. The Persian Empire was shaken, but not yet fallen. Ahead lay the richest cities of the coast, and one of them, the island city of Tyre, was destined to become the most difficult test in the young conqueror's life.
After the triumph at Issus, the path to the heart of Persia was open. But Alexander, contrary to the expectations of his generals, did not rush east in pursuit of Darius. He understood that as long as the Persians controlled their powerful Phoenician fleet in the Mediterranean, his rear in Greece remained under threat. So he turned south, along the coast, to capture the port cities and deprive the Persian fleet of its bases. Most cities, shaken by the Macedonian victory, surrendered without a fight. But the ancient, rich, and proud city of Tyre refused to open its gates. Tyre was not just a fortress. It was an impregnable bastion on an island, separated from the mainland by a kilometer-wide strait. Its walls, nearly 50 meters high, plunged directly into the sea. Alexander had no fleet to blockade the city from the water. Taking Tyre seemed impossible. But the word impossible only spurred Alexander on. He made a decision that is still studied in military academies as an example of engineering genius and incredible perseverance. If he could not reach the island by water, he would reach it by land. He ordered the construction of a mole, a gigantic causeway across the strait. Titanic labor began. Thousands of soldiers and local inhabitants, day and night, threw stones, earth, and entire trees into the sea. The causeway slowly advanced from the shore toward the island. The defenders of Tyre laughed at these efforts. They sailed out in boats and bombarded the builders, destroyed the causeway, and burned the siege towers that the Macedonians rolled along the mole. This was not just a siege. It was a war of engineers. For 7 long, grueling months, Alexander, personally participating in the work, led his army forward, conquering the sea meter by meter. When the causeway finally reached the walls and a fleet gathered from allied cities arrived at the city, the fate of Tyre was sealed. The assault was brutal. The Macedonians, enraged by 7 months of resistance, stormed the city and carried out a massacre. Tyre fell. This victory showed the whole world that there were no obstacles for Alexander, neither on land nor at sea. The way to Egypt was open. The Egyptians, who had suffered for centuries under the Persian yoke, welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, as a divine hero.
the Persian satrap surrendered the country without a fight. In Memphis, the ancient capital, the priests crowned Alexander with the double crown of the pharaohs. Now he was not just the king of Macedon and hegemon of Greece. He had become a living god, the incarnation of Horus on earth. But this was not enough for Alexander himself. He was drawn by a mystery. In the desert, in the oasis of Siwa, was the ancient temple of the god Amun, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. The oracle of this temple was as famous as the one at Delphi, and Alexander, obsessed with the question of his origin, decided to go there. It was a dangerous crossing through the Libyan desert. According to legend, when they ran out of water and got lost in a sandstorm, 2 black ravens, or, in another version, 2 snakes, came to their aid and showed them the way to the oasis. The meeting with the oracle took place in the twilight of the ancient sanctuary. The priest, wishing to greet the new pharaoh in Greek, tried to say, "O Paidion, O my child." But, speaking the language poorly, he made a mistake that sounded like, "O Paidios, O Son of God." Alexander took this slip of the tongue as a divine revelation. The oracle confirmed what his mother had whispered to him his entire life. His father was not Philip, but Amun Zeus himself. Alexander emerged from the temple transformed. Now he did not just believe, he knew he was the son of a god. And this knowledge made him even more fearless, and, perhaps, more dangerous. Returning from the desert, he founded a new city in the Nile Delta, Alexandria. He personally drew the street plan using barley flour, as there was no chalk at hand. Birds flocking from the river pecked at the flour, and the priests interpreted this as a sign that the city would prosper and feed many nations. Alexandria in Egypt was destined to become the greatest center of science and culture in the ancient world, a meeting place for East and West. The time was passing. Darius III, taking advantage of the respite, gathered a new, even more grandiose army. He was ready for a rematch. For the battle, he chose a wide plain at Gaugamela in northern modern-day Iraq. The terrain was perfectly flat, specially cleared by the Persians, so that their main strike force, chariots with scythes on their wheels, could deploy to its full potential. Darius gathered troops from every corner of his vast empire: Bactrians, Scythians, Indians with war elephants. The Persian army numbered, according to various estimates, from 200,000 to 1,000,000 men. Alexander could oppose them with only 47,000. The Battle of Gaugamela, which took place on October 1st, 331 BC, became a masterpiece of military art. Parmenion, the old general, seeing the endless sea of Persian campfires at night, suggested attacking in the dark to hide their small numbers. Alexander replied with the famous phrase, "I will not steal a victory." He was confident. Before the battle, he slept so soundly that he had to be awakened. The battle began in a thick cloud of dust. Darius launched his fearsome scythed chariots, but the Macedonians simply parted their ranks, letting them pass, and then killed the charioteers. Then, when the Persian cavalry tried to outflank Alexander, stretching their lines, a gap formed in the center of the Persian host. Alexander, personally leading the strike wedge of his heavy cavalry, the companions, was waiting for exactly this moment. With a cry that cut through the roar of battle, he directed his wedge straight into this gap, precisely where the frightened Darius was located. It was the moment of truth. History repeated itself. Darius, seeing Alexander charging at him, sweeping away everything in his path, once again lost his nerve. Despite the fact that his army was still fighting and even pushing back the Macedonian left flank, the great king turned his chariot and fled. The news of the king's flight instantly spread through the Persian army. The decapitated army turned into an unmanageable mob. The battle was over. Gaugamela marked the end of the Persian Empire. Darius fled east, where he was soon killed by his own satraps, who did not forgive his cowardice. Alexander was proclaimed King of Asia. The path to the main treasuries of the East, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, was open before him. He had reached a summit of power that no Greek could have dreamed of. But along with power, a dark shadow began to grow in his soul. The shadow of the very God he believed himself to be. After the Battle of Gaugamela, the old world collapsed. The Persian army ceased to exist, and before the Macedonians lay open the gates to the heart of the empire, to cities whose wealth the Greeks had spun legends about, believing them to be myth. The first was Babylon, the most ancient metropolis of the world, the city of the hanging gardens and the tower that reached for the sky. The people of Babylon, weary of Persian rule, strewn Alexander's path with flowers and burned incense. Alexander, showing wisdom, ordered the restoration of the Babylonian gods' temples, which had been destroyed by the Persians, and by this act immediately won the favor of the priests and the people. Then came Susa, the winter capital of the Persian kings. There the Macedonians first saw the true scale of Persian treasures. They found 40,000 talents of gold and silver in ingots, not counting jewels and tableware. This was the money accumulated by the Achaemenid dynasty over 200 years of dominion over Asia. In a single stroke, Alexander became the richest man in history. Common soldiers, their pockets stuffed with gold, began to forget the harsh discipline of Philip. They began to grow accustomed to luxury. But the main target was Persepolis, the sacred ceremonial capital of Persia, hidden in the mountains. The city that was the symbol of Persian greatness, a city of palaces of black marble and cedar, adorned with golden bas-reliefs. Alexander entered it as a triumphator. He sat on the golden throne of Xerxes under an enormous purple canopy. This was the zenith of his glory. He had avenged all the insults inflicted upon Greece over a century and a half. But it was here, in Persepolis, that one of the darkest and most enigmatic stories of Alexander's life took place. A story that showed that darkness had settled in the soul of the great commander. In the midst of a feast, when the wine flowed like a river and the victors' minds were clouded with triumph, the Athenian hetera, Thais, as the legend goes, gave a speech. She reminded Alexander how 150 years earlier, the Persian king Xerxes had burned Athens and destroyed the Acropolis. She cried that the best revenge would be if now a woman's hand were to throw a torch into this palace of pride. The wine-fueled crowd took up her call. Alexander, succumbing to the general madness, seized a torch. To the sound of music and cries, the drunken procession moved through the halls. Alexander was the first to throw the fire into the wooden paneling of the walls. The others followed his example. The palace, full of cedar wood and precious fabrics, ignited instantly. When the stupor began to recede, Alexander, realizing what he had done, ordered the fire to be extinguished. But it was too late. The greatest architectural ensemble of the ancient East was turned to ruins. To this day, historians debate, was it a drunken impulse or a cold political calculation designed to show the Persians that the old dynasty had ended forever? From this moment on, Alexander began to change. The East, which he had conquered, began to conquer him. He started dressing more and more in the Persian manner, diadem, striped tunic, girdle, which aroused the muted irritation of his old Macedonian veterans, accustomed to simplicity. He began to demand from his subjects the observance of the Persian ritual of proskynesis, prostration, and the kissing of the king's feet. For the Persians, this was a normal sign of respect for a ruler, but for the freedom-loving Greeks and Macedonians, it was an unthinkable humiliation, equating a man with a god. The chasm between Alexander and his old comrades, with whom he had grown up and fought shoulder to shoulder, began to grow. They believed he had betrayed their customs, that he had become barbarized. Alexander, in turn, saw in their discontent treason and conspiracies. He became increasingly suspicious, short-tempered, and intolerant of criticism. The tragic denouement came in Maracanda, modern-day Samarkand. At another feast, where wine again flowed without measure, an argument broke out. Cleitusъ the Black, the very same commander who had saved Alexander's life in the first battle at the Granicus by cutting off the Persian's arm, began to reproach the king. Cleitusъ was drunk and spoke what many veterans were thinking. He shouted that all of Alexander's victories were the merit of his father Philip and the Macedonian army, not of his divine origin. He reproached Alexander for surrounding himself with Persian flatterers and forgetting his old friends. Alexander, in a rage, began searching for his sword, but his bodyguards had prudently hidden it. They tried to lead Cleitusъ out of the hall, but he broke away and returned, continuing his insults, quoting verses from Euripides about tyrants. At that moment, Alexander, losing all self-control, snatched a spear from a guard and ran Cleitusъ through. A dead silence fell upon the hall. Cleitusъ fell. Alexander, instantly sobered, saw what he had done. He had killed his friend, his savior, the brother of his nurse. The horror of his deed was so great that he tried to kill himself with the same spear, but he was restrained. For 3 days he did not leave his tent, refusing food and drink, weeping and calling out for Cleitusъ. It was a sincere and profound grief, but it was also a turning point. When he emerged, he was broken, yet at the same time, he had become even harder. The philosopher Anaxarchus, trying to console him, uttered terrible words. "Whatever the king does is just." Alexander accepted this thought. He finally came to believe in his own exceptionalism, in the idea that he stood above human laws and morality.
The army, seeing his grief and his rage, fell silent. They feared him. But they still followed him. And Alexander, trying to drown his pain and guilt, sought the only medicine he knew: war. He looked at the map and saw there the final limit, the edge of the oikumene, the place where the world ends and the ocean begins. He saw India. In the spring of 327 BC, Alexander's army crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and entered India. For the Greeks and Macedonians, this was not just a campaign in another country. It was like landing on another planet. Everything here was foreign, incomprehensible, and hostile. The familiar dry steppes and deserts gave way to humid, suffocating jungles. The familiar stars in the sky changed their positions. Here lived beasts they had only seen in their worst nightmares. Enormous snakes, monkeys, and, of course, elephants. But the main enemy was not nature. It was the climate. The monsoon season began. The heavens opened up. Rain poured down incessantly for weeks, for months. This was not a refreshing Greek shower, but a warm, dense wall of water. The soldiers' clothing rotted and fell apart right on their bodies. Iron armor and swords rusted overnight. Food mildewed, bows unglued and became useless. The soldiers, who had marched thousands of kilometers, began to suffer from unknown fevers. Their skin was covered with sores from insect bites. But Alexander, as if possessed, drove them further and further east. He believed that the end of the world, that great ocean which washed the earth, was very near. In his path stood Raja Porus, ruler of the Paurava kingdom. Porus was a giant, over 2 meters tall, a man of incredible physical strength and bravery. He awaited Alexander on the bank of the Hydaspes River,
and he brought with him the weapon the Macedonians feared most of all: war elephants. The Battle of the Hydaspes became perhaps the most terrifying and bloody battle in Alexander's career. The river, swollen by the rains, had become a raging torrent. Crossing it under enemy fire seemed impossible. Alexander once again resorted to cunning. For several nights in a row, he raised alarms in the camp, feigning a crossing at different points and wearing down the Indians' nerves.
And finally, under the cover of a terrible thunderstorm, when the peals of thunder drowned out the sound of oars, he ferried his elite units to the other bank. In the morning, the armies clashed. The Macedonian phalanx, accustomed to sweeping away everything in its path, stopped. Before them, like living towers, stood 200 war elephants. The animals trumpeted, the earth trembled under their feet. The horses of the Macedonian cavalry, catching the scent of the elephants and hearing their roar, panicked and refused to move forward. It was a slaughterhouse. The elephants crashed into the infantry ranks, trampling men, grabbing them with their trunks and tossing them into the air. The Macedonians, showing unimaginable bravery, hacked at the giants' legs with axes and drove their sarissas into their eyes. The wounded animals, maddened by pain, turned around and trampled their own troops. The battle raged for 8 hours under the pouring rain, in mud and blood. Alexander was victorious. Porus, who fought to the last on his elephant and received many wounds, surrendered. When he was brought before Alexander and asked how he should be treated, he proudly replied, "As a king." Alexander, who always respected valor, returned his kingdom to him and even expanded his domains, making him his ally. But the price of victory was terrible. In this battle, Alexander suffered heavy losses, and here he also lost his oldest and most faithful friend. His horse, Bucephalus, who had been with him since childhood, who had traveled with him from Pella to India, received mortal wounds. He died shortly after the battle. For Alexander, this was a blow comparable to the loss of a close human being. On the site of the horse's death, he ordered a city to be founded and named it Bucephala. It was, perhaps, the only city in history named after a horse. The army was exhausted. The soldiers, laden with so much rich booty that they could no longer carry it, dreamed of only one thing: to return home to their families, to spend their gold and forget this endless nightmare of rains, snakes, and elephants. But Alexander announced that they were going further, beyond the Ganges River, to where even more powerful kings lived, with thousands more elephants. And then, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, the thing Alexander feared more than any enemy army happened. His own army stopped. It was not a mutiny in the usual sense. There were no shouts, no violence. It was a silent but unyielding strike, born of despair. The veterans, their bodies covered in scars, simply sat on the ground and wept. They refused to take another step east. Alexander was enraged. He gathered his officers and delivered a fiery speech, appealing to their honor, their glory, their greed. He promised them the world. But the response was silence. Finally, the old General Coenus, taking off his helmet, stepped forward and said what everyone was thinking. "King, we are men, not gods. Our bodies are worn out. Our weapons are blunted. Our clothes have turned to rags. We want to see our fathers, wives, and children while we are still alive. Knowing when to stop is also a part of greatness." Alexander, without a word, went into his tent. For 3 days he stayed there in complete solitude, like Achilles before the walls of Troy, refusing food and seeing no one. He waited, expecting the army to come to its senses, for the soldiers to come to him with apologies. But a dead silence hung over the camp. No one came. On the third day he emerged, offered sacrifices to the gods, and the priests declared that the omens were unfavorable for continuing the campaign. This allowed him to save face. He was retreating not before the will of his soldiers, but before the will of the gods. On the bank of the river that had become the limit of his conquests, he ordered the erection of 12 gigantic altars, as high as the tallest towers. As a monument to his presence there, he left an inscription. Here, Alexander stopped. The dream of the world ocean remained a dream. Alexander, undefeated by any army in the world, was defeated by the weariness of his own men. The order was given that the army had been waiting 10 years for. We are going home. The troops met these words with a roar of jubilation and tears of joy. But for Alexander himself, this was the beginning of the end. The journey back through the desert would be a trial no less terrible than the battles, and the shadow of death was already hanging over him. The journey back proved more terrible than any battle. Alexander decided to lead the army not along the known trade routes, but through Gedrosia, a scorching, waterless desert on the coast of the Indian Ocean. This decision was dictated by pride. He wanted to pass where, according to legends, the armies of legendary kings of antiquity had perished. And the desert took its terrible toll. Soldiers who had survived battles with Persians and Indians died by the thousands from thirst and heatstroke. They drank the blood of their own horses. They threw their plundered treasures onto the sand because they no longer had the strength to carry them. In this desert, Alexander showed again why men followed him. One day, when scouts found a little muddy water in a dried-up riverbed and brought it to the king in a helmet, Alexander, in front of the entire exhausted army, poured the water onto the sand. "I will not drink until my soldiers drink," he said. This gesture restored the army's morale, but the losses were colossal. Only a shadow of that great army that had entered India returned. Returning to Susa, in the heart of his empire, Alexander tried to realize his main dream, the dream of the union of peoples. He did not want to be just a Macedonian king ruling over conquered Persians. He dreamed of a fusion of West and East, of creating a new, single nation. He organized the grandiose weddings at Susa. In one day, he himself married Darius's daughter. 80 of his closest companions took noble Persian women as wives, and 10,000 common soldiers married local women. It was an unprecedented experiment in history of cultural mixing. But the old Macedonian veterans watched this with grim mistrust. They felt that their king was moving further and further away from them, turning into an oriental despot. But the most terrible blow to Alexander was dealt not by enemies or conspirators. In the autumn of 324 BC, in the city of Ecbatana, Hephaestion fell ill and died. He was not a simple general. He was his closest friend, his blood brother, his Patroclus. The man he loved more than anyone else in the world, and perhaps the only one he trusted absolutely. Alexander's grief was insane, terrible, inhuman. He behaved not as a king, but as a wounded beast. He ordered the crucifixion of the doctor who could not save his friend. He ordered the manes of all the horses in the army to be shorn and the crenellations to be torn down from the city walls as a sign of mourning. He forbade any music in the camp. On his orders, they began to build a funeral pyre in Babylon, 60 meters high, which cost a fortune. After the death of Hephaestion, something in Alexander broke forever. He lost interest in life, becoming even more cruel and unpredictable. He sought oblivion in wine and in plans for new, even more insane conquests. He wanted to conquer Arabia, Carthage, Italy.
In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander arrived in Babylon. The ancient city, the navel of the world, was to become the capital of his worldwide empire. The priests warned him that the omens were unfavorable, that he should not enter the city. But Alexander, who had defied prophecies all his life, entered. He was preparing a fleet for the Arabian campaign, but after one of the long feasts where wine flowed like a river, he felt ill. At first it seemed a simple cold or a hangover, but the fever intensified. Delirium began. Day after day, the strength left the 32-year-old master of the world. He stopped speaking, able only to move his hand, greeting his veterans who filed past his bed in tears, saying goodbye to their commander. On June 10th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died. Legend says that just before the end, when his generals asked him to whom he was leaving his kingdom, he whispered one Greek word, kratistoi, to the strongest. It was his last and most fatal prophecy. There was no strongest. There was no one who could hold in his hands this gigantic, motley world, held together only by the iron will of one man. Immediately after his last breath, the plundering began. His body had not yet cooled, and his generals, the Diadochi, were already beginning to divide the empire like predators tearing apart the body of a lion. His mother, his wives, his young son, all of them were killed in the course of the brutal wars for power. The great empire disintegrated into pieces that would war with each other for centuries. Alexander's body became the most valuable trophy. The general Ptolemy stole the golden sarcophagus with the king's body and took it to Egypt, to Alexandria, to legitimize his right to power. Alexander's tomb was a shrine for centuries. Julius Caesar and Octavian Augustus came to it to pay homage, but then, in the whirlwind of history, it disappeared. And today, no one knows where he who considered himself the son of Zeus rests. The sands of time have hidden his tracks as surely as they have hidden the tracks of the millions of his soldiers. So what remains? A legend remains. A changed world remains. Alexander did not just conquer lands. He opened the floodgates. Greek culture, language, and art poured into the East, mixing with the wisdom of Persia, Egypt, and India. The Hellenistic age began, a time when, from Gibraltar to the Indus, people spoke one language, read the same books, and built similar cities. Alexandria, in Egypt, with its library and lighthouse, became the symbol of this new, unified world. Without Alexander, there would have been no Roman Empire, no Byzantium, no modern world as we know it. He lived only 32 years. He burned so brightly that he consumed himself and the world around him. He showed humanity how far ambition can lead, and how high the price one must pay for trying to become a god. His battles have long since subsided. His empire crumbled into dust immediately after his last breath. His palaces have been covered with sand, and the location of his tomb has become one of the greatest mysteries of archaeology. From all this sound, fury, gold, and glory, only silence remains. The great, eternal, serene silence of history, which in the end swallows everything, both slaves and the greatest of kings. Alexander the Great departed into this silence, leaving behind only the echo of his name, which resounds through the millennia as a reminder of the limits of human potential.